Okay, so sorry, I just had to restart the stream, sorta. Um, yeah, that's just the notification. So, okay, so yeah, I'm gonna start with it's pretty much the first chapter would be on this not character, historical figure, um, named Lycurgus, 8th century to 7th century BC. So this is Plutarch, Selected Lives and Essays, Volume 1. Okay, sorry. Um, okay, so I guess I'm just gonna get right into it. So Lycurgus, 8th century to 7th century BC. Nothing can be said of Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta, which is not open to dispute. Historians differ as to his family, his travels, the manner of his death, and most of all, as to the laws he made and the commonwealth he founded. They do not even agree as to the age which he lived. Some say he flourished in the time of a fetus, and together they brought about the Olympic truce. Aristotle the philosopher was of this opinion, and in confirmation cites the copper quoit preserved at Olympia, inscribed with Lycurgus's name. But Eratosthenes, oh wait, Eratosthenes, Eratosthenes and Apollodorus, and other chronologers who reckon time by the reigns of the Spartan kings argue that he lived years after the first Olympiad. Timaeus believes that there were two Lycurguses at Sparta at different times, and that one of them, who was more famous, was credited with the exploits of both. The elder of the two, according to him, lived not long after Homer, and some say he even saw Homer. That Lycurgus lived in the distant past is implied by the passage in Xenophon, where he is spoken of as a contemporary with the Heraclidae. By descent, indeed, even the latest kings of Sparta were Heraclidae too, but Xenophon seemed to mean that Heraclidae, the immediate successor of Heracles. In spite of this confusion, I shall endeavor to write a history of his life, following the statements which are at least contradicted, and depending on the authors who are not most worthy of belief. The poet Simonides say that Lycurgus was not the son of Eunomus, but that both Lycurgus and Eunomus were sons of Plotinus. Most writers, however, trace his genealogy as follows: Aristodemus, Patroclus, Saus, Eurypon, Plotinus, Eunomus, and Eunomus had two sons, Polydectes by his first wife and Lycurgus by his second wife, Dionysa. Deucidas says he was sixth from Patroclus and 11th from Heracles. The most renowned of his ancestors was Zeus, for under him the Spartans enslaved the Helots and annexed a good part of Arcadia. There is a story that Zeus, when surrounded by Clitorians in the stony and waterless place, agreed to restore his conquests, provided he and all his men should drink of the nearest spring. After taking the usual oaths, he called his soldiers together and offered his kingdom to the one who would refrain from drinking. But not a man of them was able to refrain, and they all drank their fill. Zeus himself came last to the spring, and while the enemy still looked on, merely sprinkled his face and then marched off, refusing to yield up his conquests because they had not all of them drunk. Although for the reasons he was much admired, his family was not named for him, but for his sons Eurypon, for whom they were called Eurypontides, because Eurypon was relaxed the despotic tradition of the kingdom, seeking favor and popularity with the people. As a result, the people grew bolder, and succeeded kings either incurred their hatred by trying to use force on them, or weakly yielded to them in an effort to acquire popularity. So anarchy and confusion prevailed in Sparta for a long time, and was indeed the cause of the death of the king who was Lycurgus' father. He was trying to quell a riot when he was stabbed with a butcher's knife, and left the kingdom to his elder son Polydectes. But he too died soon after, and the succession, as all thought, fell to Lycurgus. In fact, he reigned until it was found that his brother's wife was with a child. At this, he at once declared that the kingdom belonged to her child if it were a male, and that he himself would exercise jurisdiction only as guardian. The Spartan name for the guardian of an orphan king is Prodicus. The queen, however, secretly made overtures to him, suggesting that she destroy her unborn child on condition that he would marry her when he was king of Sparta. Although he abhorred the woman's wickedness, he did not reject her proposal outright, but pretended to agree and accept it. He told her she should not use drugs to procure an abortion, and thus injure her health and endanger her life. He himself would see to it that the child, as soon as born, should be put out of the way. Thus he deluded her until her confinements, and as soon as he heard she was in labor, he sent watchers and guards with orders, if it were a girl, to give it to the woman, but if a boy, to bring it to him, no matter what he happened to be doing. It turned out that when he was at supper with the archons, a boy was born, and the servant brought the child to him. Taking it in his arms, the story is, he said to those around him, "Men of Sparta, a king is born to you." And he laid him down in the king's seat and called him Charilas, that is, joy of the people, because all were filled with joy and with wonder at Lycurgus's noble and just spirit. So he was ruler for only 8 months in all, but the citizens honored him on other counts. More, in fact, looked up to him and were eager to do what he said because of his goodness than because he was the royal guardian and held the power of the kings. Some, however, were jealous of him and tried to curtail his growing influence while he was still young, especially the relatives and friends of the queen mother, who thought she had been insultingly treated. Her brother Leonidas once boldly berated her brother Leonidas once boldly berated Lycurgus, saying he was sure he would be king again, thus giving ground for suspicion for an accusation against him, if anything happened to the young king, that he had plotted child's death, the child's death. Rumors of this sort were spread abroad by the queen mother also. Troubled by all this and not knowing what it might lead to, Lycurgus thought his wisest course was to escape suspicion by going abroad and traveling about until his nephew came of age and had a son to succeed him in the kingdom. With this intention, he set sail first for Crete, where he studied the several forms of government and became acquainted with their leading men. Some things he approved of, and adopted some of their laws with the intention of taking them home and applying them there. Other things he rejected as useless. One of the persons most renowned in Crete for wisdom and statesmanship was Thales, whom Lycurgus persuaded out of courtesy and friendship to go to Sparta. Thales was by profession a lyric poet, and he made a screen of his art and in reality served as a very able lawgiver. Even his odes were exhortations to obedience and harmony, and the cadence of his verses conveyed a spirit of order and tranquility, so that those who listened were unconsciously softened and civilized to the point of renouncing the feuds which were prevalent at the time and living together in love of the high and of the beautiful. Thus, in his fashion, Thales prepared the way in Sparta for the discipline of Lycurgus. From Crete, Lycurgus sailed to Asia with the aim, it is said, of studying the differences between the customs of the Cretans, who were sober and temperate, and those of the Ionians, who loved ease and luxury, just as a physician compared healthy and unsound or diseased bodies. He would then note down the differences in their ways of living and their governments. In Asia, he had apparently his first sight of Homer's poems in the keeping of the descendants of the Creophilus. And on discovering that the few licentious expressions or examples they contained were far outweighed by lessons of state and rules of morality, he eagerly collected and copied them and take back to his own country. The epics had already been heard of in Greece, and scattered portions were owned by a few individuals, but Lycurgus first made them really known. The Egyptians said that Lycurgus visited them also, and was so much taken with their way of separating the soldiery from the rest of the population that he adopted it for Sparta, and also removed all working men and artisans from a voice in the government, so as to keep the state pure and refined. Some Greek writers corroborated the Egyptians' assertions, but as for the story that Lycurgus visited Libya and Iberia, or journeyed on to India and met the gymnosophists, as far as I can find out, it all rests solely on the word of the Spartan aristocrats, son of Hipparchus. Lycurgus was much missed at Sparta and often sent for. They had kings, they said, who had the name and insignia of royalty, but otherwise nothing to distinguish them from the common people, adding that he alone possessed the spirit of a ruler and the power to hold men's obedience. Nor were even the kings averse to seeing him back, for they hoped that with him there were people who would behave less insolently. Things being in this state at his return, he promptly set about working a change and revolutionizing the system of government, since a partial reform of the law would be of no avail. Like a physician trying to cure a feeble and thoroughly diseased body, so he would use drugs and purges to reduce and change the constitution, then set it on a totally new regimen. With this resolution, he first went to Delphi, and having sacrificed to the god and consulted the oracle, returned with the famous response in which the priestess called him beloved of the gods and a god rather than a man. He was told also that the god had heard his prayer for good laws and that his constitution would be the best in the world. Thus encouraged, he labored to win to his side the leading men of Sparta, asking them to help him in his undertaking. First, he talked privately to his friends and gradually enlisted more men and banded them together for the task. When the time was ripe for action, he ordered the 30 of the leaders to go armed into the marketplace at dawn to strike surprise and terror into his opponents. Hermippus has recorded the names of 20 of the most eminent of these men. The one who was the most useful to Lycurgus in his whole enterprise and in putting his law into effect was Artemiades. When the disturbance came, King Charillus was afraid, and it was a conspiracy against himself that fled to the brazen house. But he soon learned his mistake, and on receiving oaths of assurance, left his refuge and entered into the project with the others. He was of so gentle a disposition that Archelaus, his brother king, is said to have remarked to some who were praising him, "How can Charillus be a good man? He is never severe even to the bad." Among the many changes which Lycurgus made, the first and most important was the establishment of a senate or council of elders, which Plato says, on being added to the feverish rulership of the kings, and granted an equal vote with them on vital issues, gave stability and prudence to the commonwealth. Before this, the state had no firm basis to stand on, but leaned first towards the kingship and tyranny, and then towards the people and democracy. But by the establishment of the Senate, it acquired a central ballast for the ship, which kept it in safe and steady equilibrium. The 28 senators always stood by the kings in resisting a drift towards democracy and supporting the people against the establishment of tyranny. As for the number 28, Aristotle tells us that 2 of Lycurgus's original 30 comrades dropped out for lack of courage, but Sphärus says there were at first only 28 with him. Perhaps there is some virtue in the number formed of 7 multiplied by 4, and the first perfect number after 6. For like 6, it is equal to the sum of all its parts. But I believe that Lycurgus fixed on the number 28 for the senators so that with the 2 kings they might be 30 in all. So eager was he to bring about the establishment of this government that he procured an oracle from Delphi about it called Rhetra, which runs thus: after you have built a temple to Zeus Silanius and Athena Silania, and have divided the people into Phale and Oba, and established a senate of 30, including the Archegate, you shall from time to time apelazine the people between Babica and Canation, and there propose or revoke your laws. The people shall have final voice and power. By Phale and Obe the oracle meant divisions of the people into clans and brotherhoods by the Archegate, the 2 kings. Apelazine means assemble with an allusion to Apollo, the source and author of the new constitution. Babica and Canation they now call Chermaris and Onus. Aristotle, Canation is a river, and Babica a bridge. Between this Babica and Canation they held the assemblies, for they had no hall or any other house to meet in. Lycurgus believes that architecture, far from helping, actually hindered men in their deliberations, but diverting their attention from business to idle reveries, as they gazed on the statues and pictures or mural decorations or elaborately fretted roofs. When the people assembled, they were not allowed to propose a motion, but merely accepted or rejected proposals laid before them by king or senate. In later times, when the people, by omissions or additions to the proposals laid before them, changed and distorted their meanings, the king Polydorus and Theopompus added these words to the Rhetra: But if the people vote for a distorted motion, the senators and kings shall have power to adjourn. That is, they shall not approve the vote, but dismiss the close in assembly on the ground that it was perversely altering their proposals. The same king persuaded the city that the addition too came from the gods, that this addition too came from the gods, as appears from these verses of Tyrtaeus, whatever. It's like a Greek thing. So it says, they heard the god and brought the Delphi home. Apollo's oracle words to be fulfilled. That over all within fair Sparta's realm, the honored kings and councils should bear sway. The elders next to them, the people last, accepting straightway all that was decreed. So let me read that. They heard the god and brought from Delphi's home Apollo's oracle words to be fulfilled. That over all within fair Sparta's realm, the honored kings and council should bear sway. The elders next to them, the people last, accepting straightway all that was decreed. Although Lycurgus had thus modified the nature of the state, yet those who came after him found the oligarchical element still too solid and strong, and to curb its swelling and its foaming, put, as Plato says, a bit in its mouth, namely the power of the ephors. After about 130 years after Lycurgus, the first ephors, Elatus and his colleagues, were elected in the reign of King Theo. I should have turned this ringer off. Okay. Who, when his queen one day reproached him with leaving to his sons less authority than he had received, answered, "No greater, for it will last forever, or for it will last longer. For by reducing their prerogatives, the Spartan kings freed themselves of jealousies and the danger of suffering what the kings of Argos and Messene did, who refused to give up anything or yield a little power to the people." So this is like a quote from the queen to Theopompus, I guess. Indeed, whoever... How long is this quote, or when does it end? I don't see the ending quotation mark. Is it really that long? I'm sorry. Indeed, whoever considers the seditions and the misgovernment of the people of Messene and Argos, the Spartans' kinsmen and neighbors, will find great reason to admire Lycurgus' wisdom and foresight. The three states started on equal terms. Indeed, in the land they obtained, the other two seemed to have the advantage, yet their prosperity was of short duration, for by the arrogance of their kings and the unruliness of their people, their institutions were upset, slowly clearing that the man who framed and adjusted the Spartan system had been in truth a divine blessing, but these events came later. Lycurgus' second task, and indeed the boldest he ever undertook, was redistributions of the land. There was extreme inequality here. The city overburdened with poor and needy people, while all the wealth was concentrated in the lands of a few. To make an end of arrogance and envy, crime and luxury, and of the still older and more serious diseases of poverty and riches, he persuaded the citizens to put all their land together and divide it anew, and live together as equals in means of livelihood, striving to surpass each other only in virtue. Disgrace for evil doing and credit for noble acts would be the only mark of distinction or inequality among them. Following the word with the deed, he proceeded to divide the land of Laconia into 30,000 lots, distributed among the country people. In the city of Sparta's land into 9,000 lots, for that was the number of its inhabitants. Some writers say he assigned only 6,000. lots to the Spartans, and King Polydorus later added 3,000 more. Others say that Polydorus doubled the number created by Lycurgus, which was only 4,500. Each lot was sufficient to supply a man with 70,000 or 70 bushels of barley a year, and 12 for his wife with oil and wine in proportion. This amounts Lycurgus thought enough to keep them in health and vigor, and they needed no more. It is said that some time later, on his return from a journey, he was crossing the country just after harvest, and seeing the sheaves of grain standing in equal rows, he smiled and said to his companions, "All Laconia looks like one family estate divided among a number of brothers." Next, he resolved to divide their movable goods so as to destroy every trace of property distinction and inequality. But when he saw they would resent his taking their possessions away directly, he went about it another way and met their avarice by a stratagem. First, he called in all the gold and silver currency and ordered the use of iron money instead. This he made of such great size and weight and small value that to lay by 10 minae a large storeroom was required, and to move it a yoke of oxen. With the circulation of this money, many kinds of crime were banished from Lacedaemon. For who would steal or take a bribe or grab something he could neither conceal nor possess with any pleasure, or even cut in pieces for use? For the iron had first been heated red hot, we are told, then quenched in vinegar to spoil its temper and usefulness and make it brittle and hard to work. Thereafter he ordered a general expulsion of useless and superfluous crafts. Even without his order, most of them would have vanished with the gold and silver, since there was no market for them. For the iron money could not be transported to other parts of Greece, and it had no value there, being regarded as ridiculous. So there was now no currency to purchase foreign goods and trinkets, and no cargo came into Laconian ports. No teacher or rhetoric landed there. No wandering fortune teller. No keeper of harlots. No gold or silver smith, since there was no money. Thus luxury, deprived little by little of what fed it, gradually disappeared of itself, and the well-to-do were only the same footing as other people, since their wealth had no opportunity of displaying itself, but must be kept at home idle. For this reason, common and necessary things such as beds, tables, and chairs were made better there than anywhere. And the Laconian cups, we are told by Critias, was especially liked by soldiers in the field, for its color was such that they did not see the dirtiness of water they sometimes had to drink, and its curving caught the mud and held it inside, so that the mouth got a purer drink. For this, too, they had their lawgiver to thank, because their artisans, being relieved of making useless things, showed their fine workmanship in necessary articles. The third and most admirable of his reforms to put down luxury in the thirst for riches was his institution of common meals, so that all should eat together of the same prescribed bread and meat, and not dine at home, lying on costly couches at splendid tables, given over to cooks and servants to be fattened in the dark like greedy animals, to the ruin of both mind and body. For bodies enfeebled by indulgence and overeating require long hours of sleep, warm baths, much rest, and some kind of attention daily. It was certainly an extraordinary achievement to take away from wealth its desirability, as Theophrastus says. And by the plain, common meals make it no better than poverty. For the rich who went to the same table as the poor could neither use nor enjoy nor see nor display their abundance. In Sparta, only of all cities under the sun could Plutus be seen lying blind and still and lifeless like a picture. So in Sparta only, of all cities under the sun, could Plutus be seen lying blind and still and lifeless like a picture. Men were not even allowed to eat at home first, and they go to the public tables, for the others watched one who did not eat and drink with them and just derided him for being dainty and effeminate. So yeah, that's funny. That's interesting. The rich were particularly exasperated by this last ordinance. They collected in a body to denounce Lycurgus, shouting angry insults. Finally, okay, let me just restart. The rich were particularly exasperated by this last ordinance. They collected in a body to denounce Lycurgus, shouting angry insults. Finally, some threw stones so that he ran out of the marketplace to take sanctuary. Lycurgus outran them all except one energetic and passionate youth named Eleander, who overtook him and struck him with his stick as he looked back and put out an eye. Lycurgus paid no attention to the pain, but stopped short and showed his blood-stained face with the eye out to his countrymen. They were so dismayed and ashamed at the sight that they turned Eleander over to him and escorted him home in sympathy and remorse. Lycurgus thanked and dismissed them, and keeping Alcander with him, I guess it's Alcander, sorry. There's like a little bulleted out or something. Lycurgus thanked and dismissed them, keeping Alcander with him, took him into his house. He did not hurt or reproach him, but sent away his previous servants and bade Alcander wait on him. The young man, who was of a generous nature, silently did as he was bid, and living thus day by day with Lycurgus, watched his gentleness, his simple way of life, his unruffled temper, and his unwearied labors. Thereby he became Lycurgus's devoted admirer, and told his relatives and friends that he was not the morose, ill-natured person they thought, but the kindest and gentlest of men. This, then, Alcander's punishment to be changed from a fierce, impetuous youth to a wise and well-behaved citizen. In memory of this injury, Lycurgus built a temple to Athene Uptilicius, for the Dorians there call the eye Optilus. Some writers, however, including Dioscorides, who wrote a treatise on the constitution of Sparta, say that though he was wounded, he did not lose his eye, and that he built the temple in gratitude for its healing. At any rate, after this mishap, the Spartans gave up their habit of carrying sticks into the assemblies. To return to the public meals, the Cretians called them Andrea, the Spartans Phidicia, which may be another form of Philotia. Friends, banquets because they're furnished opportunities for making friends, or the name may come from Fido, parsimony, because they teach men simplicity and frugality, or perhaps the first letter is an addition in the word aditia, that is merely food. They ate in groups of 15 more or less, and each member contributed monthly a bushel of barley flour, 8 gallons of wine, 5 pounds of cheese, 2.5 pounds of figs, and a small amount of money to buy meat or fish as a relish. And whenever a man offered a sacrifice of first fruits or had been away hunting, he sent a portion to his table, for it was kept out late by a sacrifice or on a hunt. He was allowed to eat at home, though the others had to be at the table. The custom of common meals was strictly observed for a long time. When King Aegeus returned from his victorious campaign against the Athenians and wished to dine at home with his wife, he sent for his common rations, but the Polemarchs refused to let him have them. And when the next day, out of resentment, he did not offer the customary sacrifice, they fined him. Boys were taken to public tables as schools of good manners and temperance. There they listened to political debates and so were instructed in statescraft. There they learned to talk easily, to joke without vulgarity, and to take jokes without loss of temper. Indeed, it was considered a Spartan trait to be able to stand joking, but if a boy could not, he had only to ask, the joker stopped. He only had to ask, and the joker stopped. As each one came in, the eldest present sent to him pointed to the floor. Through that door no tale goes out. New members, they say, were voted into a table in the following way. Each man took in his hand a bit of soft bread and threw it like a ballot. Each man took in his hand a bit of soft. Oh my gosh. It's like dark here. So, like, I have to readjust the angle for light. Without speaking into a bowl which a servant carried around on his head, those who voted for the candidate threw their bit in unaltered. Those who disliked him pressed it hard between their fingers. If one such flattened bit was found in the bowl, the man was rejected. So anxious were they that all should be friendly. A rejected candidate was said to be cateched, for catechus is their name for the bowl into which they threw the bread. Their most famous dish was the black broth. The older men did not even ask for a piece of meat, but dined on the broths, leaving the meat for the young. They say that a king Pontus, wanting some of this broth, brought a Laconian cook, but on tasting it found it unpalatable. Where his cook said, "O king, to enjoy this broth you must first bathe in the river Erotus." After drinking in moderation, they all went home without a torch. The use of torches on any occasion was forbidden, so that they might accustom themselves to walking fearlessly at night in the dark. Such was the style of their common meals. Lycurgus did not put his laws into writing. Indeed, one of his retras expressly forbade it. He thought that the most important principles on which the city's welfare and health depended, if imprinted on the hearts of the citizens by training and habit, would have remained more firmly fixed than by the compulsion, and that this education of the young would turn each of them into lawmaker himself. As for things of less importance, such as business contracts and other rules that change from time to time, they were better left unprescribed by written laws or rigid customs, but adaptable to circumstances and the judgment of educated men. The whole duty of lawmaking Lycurgus assigned to the educated. One retra, as I have said, forbade written laws. Another was directed against ostentation, and ordered that the roof of every house should be hewed out with an axe only, and its doors smoothed by a saw and no other tool. Epaminondas, 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 we hear, say later at his own table, treason and a meal like this do not go together. But Lycurgus was the first to realize that luxury in a house like that did not go together. For no man is so foolish and tasteless as to furnish a plain and common house with silver-footed couches, purple coverlets, goblets of gold, and the lavishness that accompanied such things. But he perforce made his bed to match his house, his coverlets to match his bed, and his other furnitures accordingly. The elder Leotychides, it is said, was so used to simplicity that when at a dinner in Corinth he saw a costly paneled ceiling, he asked the host if trees grew square in his country. A third recorded retra of Lycurgus forbade making war often against the same enemies, lest by having to defend themselves frequently they might become good warriors. This was the accusation brought against King Agesilaus. Long after that, by his frequent raids into Boeotia, he had made the Thebans a match for the Spartans. So when Anticletus saw him wounded, he said, "This is fine payment you are getting from the Thebans for teaching them to fight, when they neither wanted nor knew how to fight before." Rules like these Lycurgus called retras, to suggest that they were divine oracles. But in his opinion, the most important and noblest task of a lawgiver was education, and he began at the very beginning with strict regulation of marriage and births. It is not true, as Aristotle says, that he tried to bring the women under control and give it up, being foiled by the too great liberty and power they had acquired in the frequent absence of their husbands at the wars. Their husbands were indeed obliged to leave them in charge at home, and they treated them with overmuch respect, giving them the title of mistress. But for them too, Lycurgus made what regulations were necessary. He had the girls strengthen their muscles by exercise and wrestling, running, hurling, quoits, javelins, so that their children might have strong roots and strong bodies, and blossom well, and that they themselves might come with vigor to childbirth, and bravely and easily undergo its pains. To overcome their delicacy and effeminacy, he had the maidens as well as the young men go naked in the processions, and at certain solemn festivals dance and sing so. While the young men stood about and looked on these occasions the girls would make jokes mocking any young man whose conduct in war had been poor, or else they would sing songs in praise of those who had done something gallant, inspiring the youths to be to keen ambition. For those who had been praised for their valor went away proud and elated, and those who had been lightly mocked felt it as sharply as if they had been formally reprimanded. And all more because the king's senators and all the citizens were there too. There was nothing shameful in the nakedness of the girls. The proceedings were marked by modesty, with no trace of sensuality, and taught them simplicity of manners and love of bodily health and beauty. It gave the women also a sense of high mindedness, and if they, as well as the men, might be brave and ambitious, so they could think and speak as did Gorgo, the wife of Leonidas, who, when some foreign woman remarked to her, quote, "You Spartan women are the only ones who rule your men," replied, quote, "We are the only ones who bear men." 15. These appearances of the girls, naked in the procession in their athletic games in the presence of the young men, were incentives to marriage, and operating on the young, as Plato says, with the necessities of love, if not geometry. Furthermore, Lycurgus put a penalty of old bachelors on old bachelors, and they were excluded from the sight of young men and maidens exercising. In winter, the magistrates forced them to march naked around the marketplace, singing a song about themselves, how they were justly punished for disregarding the laws. They were also denied the honor and respect which the young men paid their elders. Thus, no one found fault with what was said to Dercyllidas, fine commander as he was, when once he approached a young man, instead of offering him his seat, simply remarked, quote, "No child of yours will ever get up for me." The marriage custom was for the husband to carry off his bride by force. She was not a little immature girl, but a well-grown woman fully ripe. After he had been taken to his house, the bridesmaids so called after she had been taken to his house, the bridesmaids so called received her, cut short her hair, dressed her in a man's cloak and sandals, and then left her alone on a mattress in the dark. The bridegroom then came, not flushed with wine, but sober and composed. After eating, as always, as the common table, he slipped into the room and loosed the bride's virgin zone and passed a short time with her. Then he left her and went back as usual to spend the night with the young men. This he would continue to do, spending the days with his comrades and sleeping with them at night, visiting his wife stealthily, afraid that someone in the house might hear them. The bride, on her part, would contrive secret meetings as chance offered. In this manner, they would go on for a long time, so that some men even had children before seeing the faces of their wives by daylight. Some meetings not only called for continual exercise of self-control, but brought the two together with their bodies vigorous and their love young and fresh, not blunted by unchecked intercourse, while their partings left in each of them some unextinguished longing and tenderness. After guarding marriage with this modesty and reserve, Lycurgus banished the vain and womanish passion of jealousy. While avoiding, after guarding marriage with this modesty and reserve, Lycurgus banished the vain and womanish passion of jealousy. While avoiding all wantonness, he made it honorable for men to share their wives with others who were worthy in the begetting of children, ridiculing those who thought such things should not be shared, and who would fight and shed blood over it. If, for instance, an old man had a young wife, and if he liked and approved of some fair and upright young man, he might introduce him to her and adopt her child by this noble father as his own. Also, if an honorable man admired a married woman on account of her modesty and the beauty of her children, he might persuade her husband to let him plant, so to speak, in this plot of good ground and produce fine children for himself with noble blood in their veins. In the first place, Lycurgus did not think that children belonged to their parents as much as to the state. Therefore, he did not want his citizens born haphazardly, but of the best parents there were. Secondly, the laws of other nations on these subjects seemed to him stupid and absurd. They took great care that their dogs and horses should have the best sires and favor or money could buy, yet they keep their wives shut up to have children only by themselves, even though they might be dull, old, or diseased, and in spite of the fact that worthless children of worthless parents show their bad qualities first to those who rear them, and well-born children show their goodness in the same way. This freedom in marriage for physical and political reasons was far from being the immorality with which their women were later charged, and adultery was unknown among them. They say that Gerardus, an ancient Spartan, when asked by a stranger how they punished adulterers, answered, "Stranger, there are no adulterers in our country, but," said the stranger, "suppose there were. The offender," replies Gerardus, would have to pay with a bowl so big that he could stand on Mount Taygetus and drink from the Erotus river below. Amazed at this, the man said, "How could there be so big a bowl?" Quote, "But how could there be an adulterer in Sparta?" said Gerardus, laughing. "Such are the reports of their marriage customs." 16. A father did not have the right to rear his offspring, but he had to carry it to a place called a lesh, where the elders of the tribe sat in judgment upon it. If the child was well built and strong, they ordered the father to rear it and assigned it one of the 9,000 plots of land. But if it was puny and ill-shaped, they ordered it taken to the so-called apothete, a chasm below Taygetus, thinking it good neither for the child nor the state that one who had not from the start been well formed for health and vigor should be brought up. So too the woman used to wash the newborn infants with wine instead of water, to test their strength. For they said that epileptic and weakly children were poisoned by the wine and fell into convulsions, whereas healthy children were strengthened by it and given firmness of body. The nurses, too, used great care and skill, putting no swaddling bands on the infants and leaving their limbs and bodies free. They taught them to be contented and easily satisfied as to food, not afraid of the dark or of being left alone, and not disagreeably, peevishly fretful. For this reason, foreigners sometimes bought Spartan nurses for their children. It is said that Amilcla, the nurse of the Athenian Alcibiades, was a Spartan, although Plato says that Pericles put him in the care of a tutor named Zopyrus, who was no different from other slaves. Lycurgus would not entrust the sons of Spartans to bought or hired tutors, nor was each man allowed to bring up, educate his son as he chose, but as soon as the boys reached the age of 7, he took and enrolled them in companies in which they lived and ate and grew, used to playing and working together. The boy who showed the most judgment and courage in a fight was made captain of his company, and the rest looked to him for orders, obeyed his commands, accepted his punishments. Thus, their whole education was a training in obedience. The older men used to watch their games and often set them to battle and contending among themselves, so as to find out which was the boldest and most undaunted in their struggles. The boys learned reading and writing as much as they needed, but the rest of the training was to make them take orders well, endure pain, and be victors in battle. To this end, they grew older, their discipline was increased, their heads were close cropped, and they were barefoot and playing, for the most part, naked. At the age of 12, they no longer had tunics to wear and were given one cloak a year. Their bodies were hard, and they seldom bathed or anointed themselves with unguents or unguents. I don't know. On only a few days of the year did they enjoy such comforts. They slept together in their troops and companies on beds made of the rushes that grew by the river Erotus, which they had to gather and break off with their hands, not being allowed to use knives. In winter, they mixed thistledown with the rushes for greater warmth. 17. When the boys reached this age, they had lovers from among the more promising young men, and to keep them company. The old men, too, kept an eye on them, coming more often to the exercise grounds to hear and see their battles of wit or strength, not casually, but with the thought that they were all, in a sense, the fatherless tutors, the governors of all the boys. Thus, every hour and at every place, there was always someone present to reprove or punish a boy who did wrong. In addition to this, one of the noblest and best men of the city was appointed superintendent over them, and each company chose as its own chief one of the cleverest and most warlike of the Irons. The Irons were those who had been graduated a year or two from the number of the boys. The oldest of the boys were called Melirons. In other words, those who would soon be Irons. An Iron, a young man of 20, was the captain when they fought their battles, and they waited on him at meals. He had the bigger boys fetch wood, while the smaller ones gathered salads and herbs. This they did by stealing, creeping cautiously, and slying into gardens and into the men's dining rooms. If one of them was caught in the act, he was thoroughly whipped for being a careless, clumsy thief. They stole whatever food they could and learned to be sharp at catching people asleep or off guard. Their meals were meager, so they were forced to depend on themselves and use all the skill and boldness they could command to cure their hunger. This was the object of their scanty fare. It helped them to grow tall, for men develop height or frame when the spirit is not held down by too much food and forced to produce thickness and breadth, but rises slightly and the body grows up unchecked and free. The same treatment seems to make beautiful men. We see this too in the case of women who take purgatives during pregnancy. They bear slender but well-shaped, comely figures, for the lightness of the material makes them more pliable for molding. However, the reason for this I leave to others to determine. 18. So seriously did the boys take their stealing that once, it is said, a youth who had stolen a young fox and was carrying it hidden under his cloak allowed the animal to tear out his bowels with its teeth and claws and died rather than let it be detected. This story becomes credible when we see that their young men now endure. I myself have seen many of them dying under scourging at the altar of Artemis Orthia. After dinner, the Iron would recline and bid one of the boys sing, and ask another some questions which required a thoughtful answer, such as which citizen is the best man, or what do you think of this man's behavior? The boys were thus accustomed early to form judgments and take an interest in politics, and not to be able to distinguish a good citizen from a bad was thought the sign of a dull and indolent mind. Moreover, they had to give sensible reason and proof for their opinions in brief and concise language. Anyone who answered badly was punished by having his thumb bitten by the Iron. Often, too, the Iron would punish the boys when elders and magistrates were present, and they might see whether or not his punishment were reasonable and just. While punishing them, he was never checked. But after the boys had left, he was called to account if he had gone too far in cruelty or in leniency and gentleness. The lovers of the boys shared in their honor and disgrace. It is said that when once in a fight a boy let fall an unmanly word, his lover was fined by the magistrates. This kind of love was understood among them, and fair and honorable matrons loved young girls, but there was no jealousy in it. Instead, those who loved the same boys made it a reason for friendship with each other, and vied with one another in trying to make the boys as accomplished as possible. possible. The boys were taught to use a terse but courteous way of speaking and to compress much meaning into few words. For Lycurgus, who, as we have seen, made iron money of great weight and little value, though contrariwise, that speech should be simple and scanty, but full of sound sense. So he had the boys trained to be silent much of the time, but able to answer concisely and to the point, just as loose and incontinent men are seldom the father of many children. So chatterers seldom say anything important or memorable. King Aegeus, when an Athenian laughed at the Spartans, short words, and said that they could easily be swallowed by jugglers on the stage, retorted, and yet with those little daggers we can generally reach our enemies. And I noticed that though Laconian speeches seem curt, it seldom misses the point and it has a great influence on listeners. Lycurgus himself apparently was brief and sententious in his talk, to judge from what has been preserved of his sayings, as, for instance, his answer to someone who proposed to establish a democracy in the state. First, quote, first establish a democracy in your own household. When another asked him why he has prescribed such small and cheap sacrifices to the gods, he replied, quote, so that we may never leave off honoring them. So that we may never leave off honoring them. Unquote. And in athletic contests, he allowed only those sports in which the citizens did not stretch out their hands. Similar sayings are ascribed to him in letters to his people. When asked how they might best prevent an invasion by their enemies, he said by remaining poor and by not each trying to be a greater man than another. Again, when asked about walls for the city, he replied, quote, a city is fortified by a wall of men, not by a wall of bricks. But the authenticity of these and similar letters, it is not easy either to accept or to deny. 20. Their dislike of long speeches is illustrated by the following anecdotes. To a man who talked to him on business, but at the wrong time, King Leonidas said, sir, quote, sir, this is wanted, but this is not when it is wanted. Charolaus, the nephew of Lycurgus, when asked why his uncle had made so few laws, answered, quote, men of few words need few laws. When Hecataeus, the sophist, was invited to the public table and spoke not one word during the meal, Archidamidas said to his critics, a man who knows how to speak knows also when. Other instances of sharp but witty retorts are the following. Demaratus, when pestered by a troublesome fellow with unsuitable questions, in particular with one as to who was the best man in Sparta, finally answered, he who is least likely yourself. Quote, he who is least like yourself. And when some people were praising the Hellenes for their just and honorable management of the Olympic Games, Aegeus said, how big a thing it is for the Hellenes to act fairly one day in 5 years. When a foreigner to whom he had shown friendliness said to Theopompus that his own countrymen called him a Sparta lover, Theopompus answered, quote, stranger, it would be better for you to be called a lover of your own city. Pleistonox, son of Pausanias, when an Athenian orator reproached the Spartans for their lack of learning, retorted, true, we are the only Greeks who have not learned some mischief from you. Unquote. And when someone asked Archidamidas how many Spartans there were, he replied, enough, sir, to keep you out of bed. Enough, sir, to keep out bad men. Sorry. We may see their character even in their jokes, for they are taught never to talk at random or utter a word that does not contain some thought worth hearing. When one of them was invited to hear a man imitate a nightingale, he said, "I have heard the nightingale itself." Another who read the epitaph, quote, "They thought to quench a cruel tyranny, but bronze-clad Ares slew them, Silenus, from her gates behind their deaths, or from her gates beheld their deaths." Said another who read the epitaph said, "It served them right, for they should have let the tyranny burn itself out." A young fellow who has promised some gamecocks that would die fighting said, "No, give me some that kill fighting." Another, seeing people taking their ease on the street, said, "May I never sit where I cannot get up to make way for an elder. May I never sit where I cannot get up to make way for an elder." The remarks were so caustic that it had been said with some justice that philosophy rather than love or exercise is the characteristic of a Laconian. Instruction in music and poetry was no less carefully supervised than the precision and purity of their speech. Their very songs were such as to rouse men's blood and stir them to enthusiastic action. They were plain and unaffected in style, and in subject serious and moral, usually praises of men who had died for Sparta, calling them blessed and glorious, or denunciations of those who had been cowardly and of all their miserable lives. They were also There were also boastings and promises of great deeds, as befitted the various ages. As an example of this last, at festivals had three choruses of the three ages, and the chorus of old men would begin by singing, "Once we were young and valiant and strong." The chorus of men would answer them, "And we are so now, if you wish, come and see." Then the third chorus, composed of boys, would chime in, "But we shall be stronger by far than you are." Indeed, if one examines the poetry of Sparta, some of which is still extant in our day, and learns the marches which they played on flutes as they charged into battle, you will find that Terpander and Pindar were right there when they said that there was a connection between music and valor. The former wrote of the Spartans, quote, "The spear and the song in her do meet, and justice walks about her street." And Pindar says, "Counsels of wise elders hear, and the young man's conquering spear, and dance and song and joy appear." They thus represent the Spartans as both extremely musical and extremely warlike. In the words of one of their own poets, "With the iron stern and sharp comes sweet playing on the harp." For before their battles, the king would first sacrifice to the Muses to remind his men, it would appear of their training and of the judgments that would be passed on them, so that they would be bold in danger and perform martial deeds worthy of record. 22. In times of war, they okay. In times of war, they relaxed somewhat the severity of the young men's regimen, allowing them to beautify their hair and wear handsome arms and clothing. They took pride in them as if they were high-spirited horses whinnying for the race. So as soon as they were out of the boyhood, they let their hair grow long, and especially in times of danger, kept it shining and well combed, remembering a saying of Lycurgus that a fine head of hair made a good-looking man more handsome and an ugly one more ferocious. Their exercises, too, were less severe in campaigns, and in other ways their life was less strenuous and strict, so that they were the only people in the world to whom war brought relief from training for war. When the army was drawn up in battle array, and the enemy near, the king sacrificed a she-goat, commanded the soldiers all to put garlands on their heads, and the pipers to play the hymns to Castor. And then he himself began the pan of advance. It was a magnificent and terrible sight to see them marching to the tune of the flutes, with no gap in their lines and no terror in their souls, but calmly and gaily led by music into the perilous fight. Such men were not likely to be either panic-stricken or over-reckless, but steady and assured, as if the gods were watching them, or as if the gods were with them. Close to the king marched some man who had been crowned victor in the Olympic Games. A Spartan, it is said, was once offered a large bribe at Olympia, but refused it, and by a great effort threw his adversary in the wrestling match. When someone said to him, "What more, Spartan, have you won by your victory?" he smiled, answering, quote, "I shall have the place in front of the king when we fight our enemies." After defeating and routing an enemy, they pursued him in his flight, far enough to confirm their victory, but then promptly withdrew, thinking it base and unworthy of Greeks to cut down and slaughter men who could fight no longer. This was not only a noble and magnanimous custom, but practically useful, for since their enemies knew that they killed only those who resisted them and gave quarter to the rest, they often thought it better to flee than to stand their ground. Hippias the sophist say that Lycurgus himself was a great soldier and engaged in many campaigns. Philostephanus attributes him the division of the cavalry into troops of 50 drawn up in a square. But Demetrius the Phalarian says he took no part in matters of war and set up his constitution in a time of peace. Indeed, the idea of the Olympic truce makes me think he was a man of gentle and peaceful temperament. However, Hermippus reminds us that some say that at first Lycurgus had nothing to do with the Ephetus and his company, but that he chanced once to come by Olympia and was watching the games, when he heard what seemed a man's voice behind him, reproving him and asking why he did not urge his fellow citizens to take part in the great festival. On turning around, he saw no speaker anywhere and was sure a god had spoken. He hastened to Ephetus and assisted him in regulating the festival so as to make it more glorious and more firmly established. 24. The training of the Spartan youth continued up into manhood. No one was permitted to leave as he chose, but all lived in the city as a soldier's camp. They had a fixed schedule and fixed public duties and thought of themselves as belonging to the country and not to themselves. When they had no other assignment, they looked after the boys and taught them useful things, or else learned something themselves from the old. Indeed, one of the greatest blessings procured by Lycurgus for his fellow citizens was ample leisure, since he forbade them to practice any mechanical art. And as for business and the toil of money-making, they were unnecessary because wealth aroused no envy and was despised. The Helots tilled the grounds for them and paid them to produce already mentioned. Hence, when a Spartan once visiting in Athens, while the courts were in session, heard that a man had been fined for idleness and was going home much depressed, accompanied by condoling friends, he asked the bystanders to show him the man who had been punished for acting like a free man. So servile a thing did they regard all labor and crafts and money in money making. With the disappearance of gold and silver money, lawsuits also disappeared, for there was no more avarice or poverty, but all were equally well off, and the life was easy, for their habits were simple. Their entire time was spent in dancing, feasting, hunting, gymnastic exercises, and conversation, and they were not at war. 25. Those under 30 never went to the marketplace, making their necessary purchases through kinsfolk and friends. And it was thought discreditable to the older men to be seen lingering there long and not to be spending the greater part of the day at the exercise grounds or the places of conversation, where they passed their time rationally talking not of money-making or of trade, but praising some honorable action or censoring something degrading with jokes and laughter, which made their instructions and correction easy to bear. For Lycurgus himself was not unduly austere. It was he, says Eusebius, who dedicated a little statue to laughter and introduced the seasonable mirth at supper to sweeten, as it were, their hard way. In short, he trained the citizens to have neither the desire nor the capacity to live by themselves, but like bees to make themselves always one with the community, clustering around their leader, forgetting themselves in the enthusiasm and ambition and devotion to their city. One can see this too in some of their sayings. Padratus or Pederatus, when not elected to the top 300, went away quite radiant and as if rejoicing that the city had 300 better men than he. And Polycratius, who went with an embassy to the generals of the kings of Persia, when asked if they came on a private or public mission, said, "Public if we succeed, private if we fail." Uh, when some citizens of Amphipolis came to Sparta and called on Argelinius, the mother of Brasidas, she asked them if her son had died bravely as became a Spartan. They praised him highly, declaring that Sparta had no one else so brave as he. Says not so, strangers, she replied. Say not so, strangers, is the quote. She replied, quote, Brasidas was a brave and gallant man, but Sparta has many better than he. 26. The Senate was at first appointed, but I have said by Lycurgus, some those who participated in his scheme, but later he ordained that when a senator died, his place should be filled by the citizen elected at the very best of those past 60 years of age. Of all the contests in the world, this seemed to be the greatest, and the rivalry the keenest. For it was not the swiftest among the swift or the strongest among the strong, but the wisest and best among the wise and good, who, as a reward of merit, was to be chosen and entrusted for the rest of his life with supreme authority in the state, with power for death and dishonor, and all great decisions. The method of election was as follows. The citizens were all assembled, and certain selected men were shut up in a building close by, where they could neither see nor be seen, but could merely hear the shouts of the assembly. For as in other cases, the people's voice decided between the candidates. These did not appear as a body, but each one came forward and silently walked through the assembly as his name was drawn. The men in the building had writing materials and wrote down in each instance the amount of cheering, not knowing who was cheered, but only that he came first, second, or third, and so on. They then announced who had received the most and loudest cheers, and he was declared elected. The garlands was placed on his head, and he went around the temples of the gods, followed by a crowd of young men hailing and celebrating him, and by many of the women who sang verses in his honors, extolling his life. Each of his relations and friends set a banquet before him, saying, "The city honors you with this table." But on finishing his rounds, he went to the common table where he was served as before, except that he was given 2 portions, the second of which he was put by. After supper, his women relatives came to the door of the dining hall, and he beckoned to the one he wished to honor and gave her the portion, saying he had received it as a prize and gave it to her as such, whereupon she too was hailed by the other women and escorted home. 27. As to burials, Lycurgus made very wise regulations. First of all, he abolished superstitious terrors by persuading them to bury their dead within the city, and place their tombs near the temples. Thus accustoming the young to such sights, so that they might not be upset by them or feel a horror of death, as if it defiled one to touch a corpse or to walk among graves. Next, he ordered them to bury nothing with the body, and to wrap it in a purple cloth with olive leaves when they laid it out. They could not inscribe the name of the dead upon his tomb, except when a man had fallen in battle, or a woman had died as a priestess. A short period of 11 days was fixed for mourning. On the 12th, they were sacrificed to Demeter, and ceased grieving. Thus nothing was left neglected, and with every necessary act of life something was mingled to encourage virtue and discourage vice. He filled the city with examples of good conduct, by which the citizens were impelled towards paths of honor. For this reason he forbade them to live and travel abroad, where they might acquire strange habits and imitate the lives of untrained people with different kinds of government. He even expelled the foreigners who came in throngs to the city on no useful errand, not as Thucydides did, or Thucydides says, because he fears they would copy his form of government and learn something for their own improvement, but in order that they might not become teachers of evil in Sparta. With strange men, strange doctrines must enter. New doctrines lead to new opinions, and from them comes thoughts and feelings out of harmony with the established order. Hence, he thought it more important to keep out bad customs than to keep out plagues from the city. 28. In all this, there is no trace of the injustice or harshness which some people ascribe to the laws of Lycurgus, calling them effective in making good soldiers, but a failure in making good men. The so-called secret service of Sparta, if it was one of Lycurgus's institutions, as Aristotle says it was, may indeed have given Plato that impression of the man and his constitution. In this service, the magistrates now and again sent some of the ablest young men out of the country, equipped only with daggers and the necessary food. By day they lay quietly hidden and dispersed in the remote places, but at night they came down into the highways and killed all the helots they found. Often, too, they ranged the fields and killed the stoutest and best of the helots as they worked. Once also Thucydides, or Thucydides, tells us in his history that of the Peloponnesian War, more than 2,000 helots who had been singled out by the Spartans for their valor were crowned with garlands and conducted like men, set free to all of the temples. But soon afterwards they all disappeared, and no man either then or later could give an account of how they died. Aristotle in particular adds that the Ephors, when first they took office, declared war on the Helots so as to make it right to kill them. In other ways, too, the Helots were harshly and cruelly treated. They were sometimes forced to drink too much strong wine and then brought into the public dining halls to show the young what drunkenness was. They were ordered to sing songs and dances that were low and absurd and forbidden the nobler kinds. Accordingly, when later Thebans invaded Laconia and captured a number of Helots, they could not make them sing the songs of Terpander, Alman, or Spendon, the Spartan, for they said their master did not allow it. So the same seems to have been true, that in Sparta the free are more free and the slaves more slaves than anywhere. For my part, however, I believe that it was later that these cruelties were practiced, especially after the great earthquake, when the Helots rose up and joined the Messenians in laying the country waste and gravely imperiled the city. I cannot myself ascribe to Lycurgus such a brutal institution as the secret service. When I remember the humaneness and justice of his character as shown in other ways, to this the oracle too bore witness. 29. When the foremost of his institutions had been firmly planted in the lives of the people, and his system had developed so that it could support and defend itself, then, as Plato says of God, that he rejoiced to see his universe beginning to live and more, so Lycurgus felt joy and satisfaction at the beauty and grandeur of his legislation, now at work and proceeding on its course. He longed in so far as human foresight could do to make his structure immortal and send it down unchanged to posterity. So, assembling all the citizens, he told them that the city was now well organized and sufficiently equipped with means for happiness and virtue, but that the most important valuable gift of all he would not bestow on them until he had consulted the oracle. They must therefore keep the laws that he had established with no alteration until his return from Delphi. After that he would do what the god commanded. They all agreed to this and bade him hasten on his journey. He then made the kings and elders, and after them the rest of the citizens, swear that they would abide by his constitution until his return, and then set out for Delphi. On reaching the oracle, he sacrificed to the god, and asked whether the laws he had set up were good and adequate for a city's welfare and virtue. The god replied that his laws were good, and that the city would continue to be illustrious as long as it was faithful to his system. He wrote the oracle down and sent it to Sparta, and sacrificed again to the god, and bade affectionate farewell to his friends and his son. resolved never to release the Spartans from their oath and to end his life by his own act. He was at an age when either to live or to die is not difficult, and when his friends seemed on their way to a comfortable prosperity, he therefore made an end of himself by refusing to take food, thinking that a statesman should serve his country even in his death, which should be not fruitless but productive of some good effect. For himself, who had accomplished tremendous tasks, death would come as the consummation of good fortune, and for his people it would ensure the continuance of the excellent things he had done for them in his lifetime, since they had sworn to maintain his constitution until his return. Nor was he deceived in his expectations. His city remained the first city of Greece for wise laws and lofty reputation for 500 years, and it obeyed the ordinances of Lycurgus. None of the 14 kings who followed him down to Aegeus, son of Archidamus, made any change in them. For the institutions of Ephors, though they thought it would favor the people, really strengthened the aristocracy. But in the reign of Aegeus, gold and silver money first flowed into Sparta, and with it came selfishness and a greed for wealth. Lysander promoted the change, for though incorruptible himself, he brought gold and silver home from the wars, and filled the country with love of riches and luxury, thus disregarding the laws of Lycurgus. While they were enforced, Sparta lived like a wise and disciplined man, rather than like a city under a government. As the poets tell of Heracles, who went over the world with his lion's skin and club, punishing lawless and cruel tyrants, so we may tell of the Spartans, that with only the common staff and coarse coat of her rulers, they had won the willing obedience of all Greece, unseating ruthless oligarchies and kings, arbitrating wars and suppressing revolts, and this often without taking down a single shield, but by merely sending a commissioner to whom all at once submitted as bees when their queen appears, swarm in order around her, such as abundance of good laws and justice there was in that city. I cannot therefore understand those who say that the Lacedaemonians knew how to obey, but not how to command, and who cite the same attributed to King Theopompus. When someone remarked to him that Sparta was safe because her kings knew how to rule, he answered, quote, no ruler, or no, no, rather because her citizens know how to obey, unquote. But people do not obey rulers who do not know how to command. Obedience is a lesson taught by the ruler, and a good ruler makes good followers, just as it is the aim of a horse trainer, to make a horse gentle and tractable. So it is the task of a royal statesman to teach men to obey him. And the Spartans inspired in other people not only a willingness but a desire to be ruled and led by them. Other Greeks sent to ask them not for ships or money or troops, but for one Spartan commander. And when they got him, they respected and revered him, as the Sicilians revered Gylippus and Chalcidian Brasidas, and all the Greeks in Asia, Lysander, Callicratidas, and Agesilaus. Everywhere these men were called regulators, censors of people and government and governors. The city of Sparta was regarded as a school of orderly life and wise institutions. To this fact, Stratonicus seemed to have alluded when he jestingly proposed a rule that the Athenians should have charged of mysteries and processions, and the Eleans should manage games, since they did that the best. But the Spartans should be thrashed if the others did poorly. It was said as a joke that Antisthenes, the Socratic, was quite serious when he said of the Thebans, whom he saw so puffed up after the battle of Leuctra, that they were like little boys strutting around because they had beaten their teacher. 31. It was not However, Lycurgus's chief aimed to leave the city ruling over many others. He thought that the happiness of a city as of an individual depended on virtue and harmony within itself. All his efforts and provisions, therefore, were directed towards making the people free spirited and independent, and keeping them so for as long as time, and keeping them so for as long as time, and keeping them so for a long time. And all those who are praised for their writings on politics, such as Plato, Diogenes, Zeno, have made use of Lycurgus's design for a state. They left behind them only written words, whereas Lycurgus left no written words, but a government which no one could copy. To those who denied the existence of a so-called natural disposition towards wisdom, he displayed the spectacle of a whole city devoted to wisdom. Thus his fame had risen high above all other Greek lawgivers. Accordingly, Aristotle says the Spartans did him less honor than he deserved, although they honored him highly, and he has a temple there, and they offer him yearly sacrifices as a god. It is said that his remains were carried home, and that his tomb was struck by lightning. Such a thing has happened to no other eminent person except Euripides, who at his death was buried at Eleuthisa in Macedonia. Euripides' admirers consider it a proof of his greatness that what happened to this most holy man and favorite of the gods happened later to him. Some say that Lycurgus died at Syra. Apollothemus thinks he was brought back to Elis and died there. Timaeus and Eratosthenes that he ended his days in Crete. Aristhaeus added that Cretians show you his tomb in the district of Pergamus, near the public road. He is said to have left an only son, Antiorus, who died childless, and so the family became extinct. His friends and relatives, however, started an annual commemoration of him, which went on for a long time. The days when they meet were called the Lycurgidae. Aristocrat, son of Hipparchus, says that Lycurgus died in Crete, and that his friends there burned his body and scattered the ashes on the sea, and that he had requested, fearing lest his remains might someday be carried back to Sparta and the people on the ground, that he had come back, and that they, absolved from their oath, might change his constitution. This is the tale of Lycurgus. Okay, so yeah, that's just the first part of the book. So that was okay. I'm glad that I got to refresh some of my memory on that anyway. I'm pretty sure that I remembered it pretty well, but I thought it was very interesting to learn more about where the Spartans got this philosophy of theirs that you can see in, like, the 300 movies and stuff that you were taught in history class in school, but they don't really teach you about the man known as Lycurgus. So I thought that it was pretty eye-opening and interesting to read from Plutarch's book, or to read from it, And some people argue that, I don't know, some people argue that there's other historians and whatnot that were like him. But I think, it's pretty cool and beneficial to be reading this kind of stuff. But anyways, I'm going to end this stream because I'm done with that first part and I'm not going to have energy to read anymore. And I've already read into this book, kind of. I've already read this part of the book, but I wanted to stream it. So yeah, the next part of the book is about a guy called Numa Pompilius, which was the second legendary king of Rome. And I thought that was perhaps even more interesting than Lycurgus, but I think that they're both pretty interesting. But maybe at some point we'll be reading that. And I'm guessing, like, at the moment, there's no comments. So I'll be the commenter. All right, well, I'm going to end the stream. So have a good day.